For the first video of 2022, I decided to finish a video I had started filming in 2021 that I still wanted to complete. It's a video based primarily on the Van Gogh paints I was able to finally get online by purchasing them at Curry's. Curry's didn't used to sell these. I used to get them from a store called Above Ground Art Supplies. For a while, that store had free shipping, but they stopped offering free shipping, so I stopped purchasing from them. Finally, Curry's Art Supplies was able to get these in for quite a reasonable price. This is the first set of the Van Gogh tubes that I ordered. They're technically student grade, but I really like them, so I also use them with my artist grade paints. The thing is, they're strangely goopy straight out of the tube, so I very much advise you pour them in pans and wait for them to dry. The longer you wait for them to dry, up to about 3 days, the better they work actually. But you can mix your own custom colors with them by experimenting, going back to the tubes, and mixing them in empty half pans. This is what I'm doing here. Here I am swatching all of the colors I got from this first art order using a prepared swatch card that I had made before, off camera, before the stuff came in the mail, that is shaped more correctly to the tin. The tin is just a cheap tin I was able to get at Dollarama for a completely different product that I just reused for half pans. I put magnets on the bottom of the empty half pans, and it's very easy to switch around the color order if you want, or to keep them in a particular order so that you have things set up for your own custom palettes. It was actually more difficult to do these swatches because I'm using the paint straight out of the tube. Going forward with the Van Gogh paints, I'm probably going to let them dry a bit, but it's really hard to have enough patience because you want to see the new paints right away. However, once again, they work better if you actually let them dry. Inside a Dollarama sketchbook, I'm working out different things here. I forgot to record the initial swatches in this sketchbook, but here are some recordings of me making some color mixes. All the color mixes that I'm doing now are going to be using other colors here with the rose color. So the first one here is the rose and carmine. I have the colors labeled here as well. I'm going to explain all the colors I purchased in a moment as well, so that you can tell which ones I actually picked up. I picked up these colors, which end up working together as quite a beautiful palette, specifically because I felt like they filled the gaps in my overall watercolor collection better than other choices. I also like to use watercolor with gouache and mix up both medias together. You can't quite replicate it with other colors, so it's very useful. Rose, PR 122. Followed by the Drop Dead Gorgeous, Cool Red Carmine, PR 176. Followed by the very glorious Turquoise Green, PB 15 and PB 29 mix. Followed by the equally gorgeous but more bluish Turquoise Blue, PB 15 and PG 7 mix. Followed by the useful but definitely a bit opaque Lavender, PB 29, PB 15, and Pigment White 6, PW 6. The very useful neutral tint. I've been meaning to get one in some brand, and I ended up getting Van Gogh for now. PBK 6, PV 19. The useful greenish gray Davies Gray, PBK 11, PG 7, and PBR 7. And Titanium Buff, PW6 and PBR7. A touch of brown added to white, although some versions of Titanium Buff are pure white that has been treated to turn slightly off-white. The other swatches on this page are used by mixing only these particular colors, and a little sneak peek at the Quin Rose, which I'd purchased in the past and was replacing. I love this mood page, which has a bunch of gradient swatches of all my different colors. A mix of gouache and watercolor. Here I'm going to show myself re-wetting and using a bunch of these colors, including special mixes I made. These mixes here are based on the Vintage Pastel set that I created dupes for by mixing various colors. A lot of the colors used for these mixes are not the new Van Gogh paints, but various other watercolors I have. As you can see, I spritz spray to re-wet them and use an eyedropper. Re-wetting the paint right before painting often works a lot better. Some of these are certainly classified as gouache due to their use of opaque white pigments. The mix of the white I used to mix all these dupe colors up is a mix of Chinese white and my Titanium Buff, because they only need to be slightly off-white mixed in with it, but mostly normal white, which I also have as a half pan in this particular palette. Unfortunately, you can see the bleed happening by the color accidentally bleeding into the previous one, but I was trying to just get it done quickly. On a separate page, I did a couple of the other greens I got afterwards. All these paints featured here are ones that I purchased on a different order in order to fill out my collection a little bit more. But I didn't show the unboxing for that. I guess I was too impatient, or maybe something went wrong with the recording. I actually don't quite remember. On these pages, I'm doing various mixes. I'm trying out different mixes using only the colors found on this long, narrow palette featured in this video. Some of which are mixes using the Van Gogh paints, some of which are the Van Gogh paints originally, and a bunch of them are mixes duping, as I said, the Vintage Pastel set by Prima Marketing. I couldn't buy the original Prima Marketing set as I was hoping to find it on sale, and I'd done far too much research on the Prima Marketing Vintage Pastel set, so I started really wanting it, but the price was too high considering the quality of the paint and the lack of light fastness. So I decided rather than buying it, I'm going to figure out how to dupe it myself. So I figured out how to dupe a bunch of the colors using colors of watercolor paint I already own. I made, as I said, a mix of the buff titanium Van Gogh paint, and I used a Turner Artist watercolor Chinese white, which is a less opaque white pigment. But white is still opaque, and once you start mixing white in, you're making more of a gouache than a true watercolor, which is fine by me, as I really like gouache. I mix gouache and watercolor, and I use them together. So for me, there's no problem at all with these colors being definitely a little more gouache and less true watercolor. As you can see, I'm experimenting by mixing different combinations of these paints together. Some of them have more of one color than another, and some are really more of a 50-50 mix, just trying to see what happens when I mix the colors. These kind of color mixing experiments are really good for getting to know your paints and getting to know color mixing in general, so I definitely advise them for everyone. Here I'm trying out how I can mix the different colors to get different effects. By actually trying it out, I can really learn and commit to memory more about how color mixing in general works and how these specific colors work. I'm doing this on cheap paper, but you should know that the results, the way the paint works, and the colors exactly might look slightly different on different papers. Another good thing to do is to try out actual painting of subjects using the colors. Sometimes using a limited palette can spark creativity, whereas other times you don't want to limit yourself. So really go with what's working best for the kind of flow state you can achieve. It doesn't have to be the greatest handwriting in the world, but as long as you can read it. I advise you label what the color mixes are that you've done. If you put a particularly large amount of one color, you can also note that down. Otherwise, at least note which colors you mix to get the different mixes. This will help you later. Some days it's easy to figure out color mixes, and other days you can refer to things you've mixed in the past to help you with paintings and things you're working on. When you look at a series of things you mixed with a particular palette, you can decide which palette to use. You can also look things back up, like I said, on days when you're having trouble, and actually see which colors you can mix. Another reason why I'm mixing all these colors is to work out if I want to make any other pre-mixed colors. As you can see, there are 6 remaining empty half pans in this palette, for example, and I have other palettes of empty half pans I've purchased and gotten ready. I like to have as many colors pre-mixed as possible. That's why I prefer tube paints. You get more for your money and you can pre-mix your own colors. So, a lot of these mixes are done for an additional purpose. If I create a mix that is different than the other colors I have throughout all my existing palettes, but it's a great starting point and I'd like to see it again and again, I will pre-mix it up. And now to share my vintage pastel dupe recipes. In the top left is my periwinkle, which is primarily the Chinese white mixed with titanium buff, with a touch of ultramarine deep. I used Sennelier's ultramarine deep, but any ultramarine deep might do. The second one over is sage, which is primarily, again, the Chinese white mixed with titanium buff mix, with a touch of Daniel Smith's perylene green. A perylene green of any variety would probably do, or something similar to a blackish green. The golden glow is the next one over. It is primarily Cotman raw sienna, which is a lower grade, but I find it really good for mixes actually. Also with some Ultramarine. I used Turner Artist Watercolours Ultramarine, but any brand would probably do, as they're quite similar. Followed by Dusky Mauve. It is my Van Gogh Rose plus the Van Gogh Neutral Tint, mixed with a large quantity of the Chinese White and Titanium Buff. You can adjust the levels that you mix when you mix these to try to get it correct, as long as you test it out while it's still wet and make sure the color looks good. Cotta is the next mix. I used Daniel Smith's Aussie Red Gold plus my Turner Artist Watercolor Yellow Ochre, though any brand of yellow ochre should do, and I used Terra Rosa, which is by M. Graham, as well as the Chinese White and Titanium Buff mix. I believe any very bright, slightly golden yellow color mixed with a Terra Rosa, which is a PR 101 reddish brown, and any yellow ochre can probably come up with a similar mix. Next is my suede mix. That one's quite simple. It's the Chinese White with the Titanium Buff, plus a small amount of raw umber. Any brand of raw umber should do. Breezy is the Chinese White and the Titanium Buff mix, added with a little bit of Daniel Smith's Phthalo Turquoise, although this one has a bit less of the white and a bit more of the turquoise, but it's quite a strong color, so be a little careful. For the Apple Blossom, the final dupe mix in this example set, I used Van Gogh's Quinacridone Rose plus the Chinese White and Titanium Buff mix. You'll of course need to experiment and see which paints you have that are similar to try to get these similar mixes. Now I'm going to do an artwork using just this color palette. The thing is, I looked at reference of various beaters as inspiration while thinking about Maniraptorans, the Dromaeosauridae, raptor dinosaurs. Very, very feathered, between dinosaurs and birds, basically. And I was thinking about that sort of idea, so I was inventing my own Dromaeosaurid, and I was creating a color palette that I was going to use for this based on various real bee eaters, but not exactly like any of them. More inspired by the watercolor palette itself. I'm using a Stabilo All pencil to do the main sketching in here, as well as erasing and adjusting as needed. I'm going to be using soft makeup brushes primarily for this, and being a bit gentle because the paper I'm using is not intended for watercolors and is not the so-called correct paper for this. However, by working quickly wet and using makeup brushes, I can get soft gradients and blends, and I'm trying to make the best of these materials used on the wrong type of paper. This is a good thing to do if you don't have a huge budget or if you just want to challenge yourself, but you are struggling against the materials. Using a larger soft filbert style makeup brush here, I'm laying in some soft pale tones. I'm mostly using the Vintage Pastel colors here to get some of the bases here. I'm looking at the pictures of the bee eaters and being inspired by the real animals while working things in a more fantastical way. One of the reasons I went with a bee eater inspired Dromaeosaurus is because I wanted to do something a little fantastical or based on extinct animals, but I also wanted to make the best use of these colors, like I said. And when I think about these colors, it kind of makes me think about bee eaters. So I decided to pull out my reference page of bee eaters and do something inspired by that. It's also important to remember that you need to be careful about how you're doing this, working wet and wet. When you need to keep working to get things blended and merged together, and when you need to completely stop and let it completely dry. Being impatient can lead to poor results, but other times you're going to need to make sure things are dry before doing the next step, especially with things like watercolor. Other times you want a blurred or soft edge, and you don't mind if there's a bit going on with the edging here. I was a little impatient and kept going, because I didn't mind if some of the edging here was actually a little blurred out, so that the feathers would look soft and the transitions would look soft. So I decided to keep going for this section here, where I'm just using the pure neutral tint, in place of using a proper black. So while you're working on a project, you need to figure out when you need to wait for things to dry and when you should continue painting to get that more soft or blurred edge. You can also gently drag a clean, damp brush from one color to another to force more blending, or with a very little amount of the color and gently drag to blend. I'm making sure to go over everything with a little bit more of a brighter dusky mauve and trying to get more of the colors in I like. As you can see, I cut for drying time. Some of the colors actually dried darker while some dried lighter. The the dusky mauve turned a bit darker than when it was wet, to get the eyes, the carmine. I'm using the terracotta color here with a bit of the neutral tint and a bit of the white in order to make these branches. I'm just freehanding them in, looking at different references of branches and getting the general idea. I'm using some opacity with the white to get some highlight effects on the branches. At some points, I'm mixing in a little bit of very soft makeup brush with a little bit of neutral tint, Davies gray and other tones in order to get some extra shadow in here, although I'm more focused on the general look than making sure everything has perfect shading. And here's the final painting. The contrast on the shadows and lights isn't that high, but in general it's a pastel looking dromaeosaurid bird creature. Once again, that's all for this video. If you like my videos, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell to all notifications so you will know when a new video comes up. I aim for new videos every Wednesday, but sometimes life happens and things are delayed. I hope that you enjoyed this video and will see you with another one very soon.